Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are cracking open the blueprint of the human mind. But we're not really looking at some kind of metaphorical map here.
No, not at all.
We're focusing on the durable structures that actually define our reality. Our mission is to explore this really intimate, functional relationship between the stories we carry, our beliefs, our internal narratives, and the physical architecture of our neurology.
Right, and that's a crucial distinction, I think. We often think of beliefs as like soft concepts, things that can change easily. But the sources we're looking at today, drawing from psychology, clinical neurology, ancient wisdom even, they suggest the opposite. Beliefs are much more like filtering architectures. They're kind of the operating system of the brain.
The operating system. Huh?
Yeah, and they dictate what information gets processed, what gets through, and importantly, what gets ignored or dismissed.
Okay, let's unpack this central metaphor straight away then. Belief as architecture. The sources, especially those pulling from Jordan Peterson's work, they frame human existence in these two permanent kind of competing domains. And understanding these is really key to why we build these structures in the first place, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Life is, you could say, permanently divided between the domain of the known and the domain of the unknown.
Okay. Known and unknown.
The known is, well, it's order, it's stability, it's the culture you understand, the rules you follow. It feels predictable, safe.
Familiar territory.
Yeah. The unknown, on the other hand, that's chaos. It's novelty, it's the terrifying potential of everything outside your current map.
And the brain needs different ways to handle these, right?
Yeah.
It can't just treat, a sudden emergency the same way it treats making your morning coffee.
Exactly. The nervous system has evolved these, distinct operational modes. When you're firmly in that known territory, your attention might be broad, but your actions are often automatic, structured, efficient. But when you encounter the unknown, say, a threat, or a huge unexpected change in your life, caution and fear initially just flood the system.
And that fear, that's the signal saying, hey, the existing map, the current architecture, it's not enough for this situation.
Precisely. To survive and adapt, that initial fear has to be superseded by creative, exploratory behavior. And that exploration, that's the mechanism of construction. It's how we build.
So the goal isn't just avoiding the unknown.
No, the adaptive goal is to convert that initially terrifying chaos into something beneficial, or maybe just something irrelevant that you can safely ignore. You need to integrate it into the known world somehow.
And doing that requires building and constantly updating these behavioral patterns and representations, essentially, the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works and how we should act in it.
That's the core of it.
But these structures, once they're built, they need serious maintenance. And if some piece of information comes along that threatens the integrity of the whole thing, well, the brain fights back. It tries to stabilize the system. And this brings us right to that psychological imperative for consistency. This is Leon Festinger's big idea, right? Cognitive dissonance.
Yes. If beliefs are these durable structures, then cognitive dissonance is that deep, uncomfortable feeling that arises when those structures get, uneven or contradictory.
Like a wobble in the building.
Exactly. When two of your beliefs clash, or when your actions don't line up with what you say you believe, that inconsistency generates a kind of psychological pain.
It's like the structural maintenance crew inside your head starts screaming about a crack in the foundation.
That's a great way to put it. It's really the driving engine behind human rationality, or maybe more accurately, rationalization. Festinger's whole point was that we're biologically motivated to reduce this dissonance, to restore that feeling of internal consistency.
So we're not always seeking objective truth.
Often, no. We're seeking internal peace. And frequently, the easiest way to get that peace isn't to change our difficult circumstances or our actions, but simply to change how we think about them, to adjust the story.
Okay, so now we need to really drill down into these structural foundations themselves, starting with just the sheer physical stability of our wiring. When we say beliefs are rigid architecture, it's not just a cool metaphor. Pavlov's early work, with the dogs and the bells.
Right, classical conditioning.
Yeah, that actually offers a fascinating physical parallel for these really deep-seated, often quite inflexible beliefs.
It really does. The sources point out that Pavlov's lab, through all those rigorous conditioning experiments, they found cases of what they called extreme stability within the cerebral cortex. This applied to both the processes that excite neurons and those that inhibit them.
Extreme stability. So it wasn't just a minor tendency.
No, it showed just how incredibly deep and fixed our learning can become, how ingrained these pathways get.
And this even showed up as different personality types, right? Even in the dogs. What did that look like?
Well, Pavlov started categorizing dogs based on their fundamental nervous system types, their basic wiring, if you will. The stronger, more resilient dogs, they had this exaggerated excitatory process.
Meaning they could get fired up and stay fired up.
Basically, yeah. It indicated a highly resistant nervous system, capable of performing huge amounts of coordinated activity, enduring stress without breaking down. These were the dogs that could adapt quickly to new, complex conditioning schedules.
So a resilient nervous system meant a better capacity for adaptive behavior, for turning that unknown chaos into something known and manageable.
Absolutely. And then conversely, other dogs showed a clear predominance of inhibition. They were more timid, easily overwhelmed. Pavlov considered them the weaker type, often incapable of sustained adaptation even to ordinary life challenges in the lab.
Wow.
What this really demonstrates is that the internal physical wiring, the balance of excitation and inhibition, it determines your fundamental responsiveness and your capacity to adapt. If your nervous system is inherently more fragile or predominantly inhibitory, your ability to handle chaos and novelty is, well, fundamentally constrained from the get-go.
So the hardware itself kind of sets limits on the sort of architectural narrative we can build and maintain effectively.
It certainly seems to play a huge role, and crucially, Pavlov also noted how this stability could be managed, even strengthened. He found that continuous excitatory activity, just pushing and pushing, leads to exhaustion. Burnout, essentially. It requires recovery.
Makes sense.
But maybe counterintuitively, he found you could actually reinforce the system by shortening the intervals between activity and rest. Practice, rest, but maybe with shorter rest than you'd think. This disciplined approach strengthens the system, allowing for better overall recovery and increasing its total capacity over time.
That gives us a physical model for how we build mental endurance, doesn't it? It's like intentional, disciplined practice followed by measured rest, build stronger mental structures.
Precisely. Flexibility and strength coming through a kind of rigid, intentional training protocol.
But these deep structures aren't just about learned responses. Some of the framework seems to be, well, prepackaged. Which brings us to Carl Jung and the idea of archetypal filters.
Right. Jung's idea was that the psyche isn't a blank slate, a tabula rasa. He proposed it has an a priori structure, something that exists before experience. He called the deep layer the collective unconscious, and its contents are the archetypes.
Like blueprints for basic human experiences.
Kind of. He saw this internal matrix, or form, as something that antedates all conscious experience. It acts like a filter, or maybe a mold, into which our life experiences are poured. The vessel shapes the water, you know.
So we don't invent the idea of a hero, or a mother, or a shadow from scratch every generation.
His theory says no. We recognize them because the potential form for them already exists within us, within this collective unconscious. And this innate structure conditions how we perceive and interact with the world.
How so?
Well, Jung observed that a person, especially someone unaware of their inner life, which he saw in so-called primitive man, but argued definitely extends to modern people who aren't self-aware, often projects these internal archetypal facts onto the external world. They see the outer world primarily as a reflection of their own inner dramas and struggles.
That sounds like a situation where the subject and object, the inner and outer worlds, are kind of fused together, undifferentiated.
Exactly. It's a profound lack of differentiation. The external world becomes almost like a fluid phenomenon caught up in the stream of their own fantasies, their own projections. If I have a really strong internal shadow archetype, the dark side I don't want to admit to, but I refuse to acknowledge it in myself.
Then you start seeing shadows everywhere else.
Precisely. I'll likely project that darkness and ill intent onto other people, onto situations, seeing threats and negativity where maybe they don't objectively exist. My internal architecture is painting the external world.
And this filtering process ties directly into how we build our own sense of self, doesn't it? Peterson often talks about how these images of successful ways of being, successful behavioral patterns, become the foundational materials for our personal stories.
Yes, these extracted images, often drawn from culture, myth, and observation, they're the building blocks. Think about the admirable adult figure, or the archetype of the benevolent father, or the classic hero who confronts the dragon of chaos.
These are just nice stories.
No, they're powerful metaphors. They mediate between our basic procedural knowledge, like how to tie our shoes, and this vast, complex universe of order and chaos we have to navigate. Our personal story, our sense of self, is largely built by aspiring towards or maybe reacting against these foundational archetypal structures.
Okay, to really hammer home the durability, the physicality of this architecture, we have to look at what happens when it actually physically collapses. And this is where the incredible, almost unbelievable clinical case studies documented by the neurologist Oliver Sacks come in.
Yeah, Sacks's work is profound here.
These examples prove, I think, beyond any doubt, that the neurological architecture is the experience of reality.
Absolutely. Take the case of Dr. P, the man Sacks famously wrote about in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's one of the most, well, chilling demonstrations of architectural failure you can imagine. Dr. P was intelligent, a talented musician, still functioning in some ways, but he suffered a profound loss of real visual perception.
He wasn't technically blind, but he couldn't grasp the meaning of what his eyes were taking in.
Exactly. His visual cortex seemed okay, but the brain systems that are supposed to integrate that raw visual data with memory, emotion, context, those had failed catastrophically. He saw the world as just lifeless abstractions, geometric forms, lines, features.
Seeing components, but not the whole picture.
Precisely. He construed the world like a computer might, identifying objects by key features, like famously describing a glove as a continuous surface unfolded on itself, appearing to have 5 outpouchings, but completely missing the overall reality, the gestalt of what the object was, what it meant, how it functioned in a human world.
He couldn't integrate the visual input into his stored narrative, his architecture of the world. It was just data. Raw, meaningless data.
And this profound disconnection wasn't just external. It extended internally, too. Sacks asked him to imagine standing in a familiar town square and describe what he saw. Dr. P could only list the buildings that existed on the right side of his imagined square.
Whoa.
Yeah. He couldn't access the left side of his own mental image. It proved that his internal visualization, his memory itself, was somehow bisected, fractured, along with his external perception. The architecture of his mental map had literally split, showing how dependent our memory and imagination are on this physical structure, just like our sight.
That is. Yeah, profound doesn't quite cover it. It's not just a glitch in seeing. It's a fundamental failure of the self-narrative that's built on perception.
And then consider another patient Sacks described, one who suffered from what's called modality-specific amnesia. After a stroke destroyed the visual parts of his brain, making him completely blind, the patient didn't just lose his ability to see.
What else did he lose?
He lost all visual images and all visual memories. Everything he'd ever seen.
He couldn't remember what things looked like.
More than that, he lost the idea of seeing. He lost the concept of light itself. The source material states he effectively became a non-visual being. His entire lifetime of visual experience, the whole mental architecture built around sight, was just erased, gone.
Wow.
It's a stark illustration that our reality, our memory, our very concept of the world is fundamentally constituted by the neurological architecture we possess. If that framework is damaged or destroyed, the experience it enables just goes with it. It ceases to exist.
Okay, the lesson from Sacks is pretty stark then. If our architecture is faulty or collapses, the consequences are devastating. And the huge implication here is that we will fight, maybe unconsciously but ferociously, to defend our existing architecture, even if it's clearly flawed, because the alternative, total collapse, feels unthinkable.
Right. Which brings us back to Festinger and the sheer power of dissonance reduction. This is the psychological engine driving that defense.
So how strong is this defense? What makes the dissonance worse or triggers a stronger defense?
Well, Festinger identified key factors that determine the magnitude of the dissonance, how uncomfortable it feels, and therefore how hard we work to reduce it. First, there's the importance of the decision, or the belief we hold. Changing a minor opinion causes less dissonance than questioning a core life belief.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, the attractiveness of the alternative you didn't choose. If the rejected option was really appealing, you'll feel more dissonance about your choice.
So because you keep thinking, maybe I should have gone the other way.
Exactly. And third, and this one's a bit trickier, the amount of cognitive overlap between the chosen and the unchosen options.
Okay, cognitive overlap. Can you unpack that a bit? That one feels less intuitive.
Sure. Cognitive overlap is about how similar the attributes are between the two competing options. Let's say you're choosing between car A and car B. They're both black sedans, roughly the same price, similar safety ratings, both have decent stereos, they share a lot of features, high cognitive overlap.
Right, so why would that increase dissonance? Wouldn't having similar good options make you feel better about either choice?
Not necessarily after the choice is made. Because post-decision dissonance is all about justifying the choice you did make, making it feel clearly superior. If car A and car B are almost identical and both pretty good, it becomes incredibly difficult to find clear, non-overlapping reasons why car A was definitely the better pick.
Okay. It's harder to build that convincing story for yourself.
Exactly. The difficulty in differentiating them increases the discomfort, the dissonance. It forces you into more intense, effortful rationalization to convince yourself. Now, if car A was that small sedan and car B was a giant pickup truck, very low overlap, it's easy to rationalize. Oh, I definitely needed the fuel economy, or I absolutely needed the hauling capacity. You focus on the big differences. High overlap means harder rationalization work and thus higher dissonance.
So the brain kind of prefers simpler narratives, clearer distinctions, even if they aren't totally accurate, just to reduce that uncomfortable feeling. Our motivation is to kill the discomfort, often by tweaking our thoughts about the options, reinforcing that belief. Yep, I definitely made the right choice.
And you see this structural defense playing out everywhere. The classic example Festinger studied was new car buyers reading advertisements after they bought the car.
What did they find?
They weren't reading ads for the cars they didn't buy, comparing features. No, they were almost exclusively reading ads and reviews that praised the car they already owned.
Oh, so they weren't seeking objective information, they were seeking fortification, looking for more bricks to shore up the wall of their decision, adding consonant cognitive elements, as Festinger put it.
Exactly right. And our social groups become a huge resource for this. We seek confirmation for our beliefs from others who already agree with us. We tend to selectively interact with people and guide conversations in ways that facilitate hearing things that align with our views.
Yeah, if a tricky fact challenges my belief system, my first instinct might be to call up a friend who I know agrees with me, just to get that validation. It's like outsourcing the structural maintenance work.
It really is. And you see this amplified massively in groups or movements facing total disconfirmation, where the stakes are way higher than just buying a car.
Like what?
Well, the dramatic example is what Festinger called mass proselyting in response to failed prophecy. Think about the Millerite movement back in the 1840s. They had definitively predicted the second coming of Christ would happen on a very specific date.
Okay, high-stakes prediction.
Extremely high. And when the day came and went, it became known as the Great Disappointment. Their foundational architecture was just shattered, obliterated by reality.
The ultimate disconfirming evidence. So what do? Fold up shop?
Not initially. Instead of concluding the core belief was fundamentally wrong, many of the most committed members actually intensified their efforts. They started rationalizing the failure. Oh, we misunderstood the nature of the event, or the timing was slightly off, but it's still coming soon. And they began urgently trying to convert more people to their belief.
Wait, why try to convert more people after being proven wrong?
Because, according to dissonance theory, converting others provided desperately needed social support. It facilitated the addition of massive new consonant cognitive elements. Look how many people are joining us now. We can't all be wrong. This just proves our fake is strong. The defense of the collective belief structure became more important than the objective, undeniable reality.
That level of denial, actively rejecting disconfirming evidence, that sounds like the absolute core definition of selection bias, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. Selection bias is the practical day-to-day manifestation of this dissonance reduction defense mechanism. It's when you set up a default story in your mind, and that story dramatically skews how you perceive information and make decisions going forward.
How can you tell if you're doing it? What are the signals?
Well, the field card source we looked at gives some good cues. One is noticing quick certainty in yourself, jumping to conclusions that fit your narrative without much questioning. Another is feeling immediate defensiveness when a fact or an opinion challenges your view. A third is having a selective memory, only easily recalling the facts that support your position.
So if you notice those things in yourself, those are red flags that you've probably stopped looking for disconfirming evidence. You stopped being open to updating your architecture.
Pretty much. You're in maintenance mode, possibly defending a flawed structure.
So the antidote to bad architecture isn't just being smarter, is it? It sounds like it's more about cultivating a willingness to question your own certainty, to actively seek out potential flaws in your own thinking.
That's the core anti-dissonance strategy, yes. One practical technique is to deliberately ask yourself, okay, if I were fundamentally wrong about this, what specifically would I be missing? What evidence might I be ignoring?
Forcing yourself to look for the cracks.
Exactly. Another technique is running a premortem. Imagine your decision or your belief system has failed spectacularly 6 months from now. Okay, now list all the likely reasons why it failed. This forces you to acknowledge potential flaws in your blueprint before the structure actually collapses, allowing you to maybe design some safeguards or reconsider now.
That's powerful. And finally, this whole mechanism plays out huge in our relationships, right? These deep internal belief structures, maybe based on old wounds or unmet needs, they get exported wholesale. We turn our partners into screens onto which we project our inner world.
Oh, absolutely. Our relationship patterns often become the clearest, most visible outward expression of our internal defensive architecture. Unhealed wounds frequently show up as very specific, recurring defensive patterns in relationships, things like chronic criticism, contempt, maybe crippling people-pleasing, or conversely, aggressive avoidance and withdrawal.
Like the avoiding attachment style, their typical thought patterns seem like perfect examples of this self-protecting, often all-or-nothing belief architecture in action.
Textbook examples. They're essentially running this internal defensive script designed to prevent vulnerability or perceived engulfment.
So what does that internal dialogue sound like when intimacy starts to challenge their existing, comfortable architecture of self-sufficiency?
Well, the characteristic thoughts often involve immediate rationalization to justify pulling back. Things like, see, I knew she wasn't really right for me. This small disagreement just proves the whole relationship is flawed. Or, ugh, I need to get out of here. I feel completely suffocated.
So they overgeneralize. A temporary discomfort becomes proof of a permanent structural flaw in the entire relationship.
Exactly. They tend to ignore the reality that successful partnerships inevitably involve discomfort, negotiation, vulnerability, and mutual responsibility. Instead, they rationalize withdrawal to maintain that familiar, comfortable, distant structure that preserves their sense of independence, even if it ultimately leaves them feeling lonely. The architecture defends itself.
Okay, so this rigid architecture of belief descended so strongly, it seems almost impossible to change sometimes. But the great discovery, maybe the hope from modern psychology, is that these structures, while incredibly durable, are not totally immutable.
Right, change is possible.
But the process of rebuilding requires, it sounds like, a really disciplined deconstruction of the old restrictive narrative and then the intentional active construction of a new one. We can start with Martin Seligman's work on learned optimism. How does that fit in?
Seligman's work is really about changing our explanatory style. That's the internal dialogue, the story we tell ourselves right at the point when adversity hits. When something negative happens, the depressive explanatory style is inherently architectural. It automatically builds this permanent, limiting structure of self-defeat.
And that structure is defined by those famous 3 Ps, right?
That's right. Personal, permanent, and pervasive. Personal, it's all my fault, I am intrinsically bad at this. Permanent, this always happens to me, I'll always screw this up. And pervasive, this failure ruins everything. My whole life, career, relationship is a disaster now. You see how that style immediately takes the failure and cements it into the core architecture of the self.
Yeah, it becomes a load-bearing wall of negativity.
Yeah.
So the resilient style, learned optimism, is about actively reframing that structure, allowing for more flexibility, more room to recover. How do we actually make those shifts in thinking?
Essentially, you learn to consciously reverse the Ps. First, you shift the attribution away from the self. You make it less personal and more external or situational. So instead of I am incompetent, the thought becomes something like, okay, my boss was under a lot of pressure today, or, the instructions for that project were actually really unclear.
Okay, finding external factors.
Second, you make the reason unstable or temporary, not permanent. So instead of I always screw up, the belief shifts to something like, okay, I can change this next time, or yeah, I really should have taken 5 more minutes to proofread that email. Lesson learned.
So it acknowledges the error, maybe, but frames it as a correctable behavior, not some fixed, fatal flaw in who you are.
Exactly. And third, you make the outcome specific rather than pervasive. So instead of my whole career is tanked because of this one mistake, it becomes, okay, that specific report wasn't my best work, but it's just one report. This cognitive reframing process literally helps dismantle that old, rigid, I am fundamentally lousy structure. It turns adversity into a temporary, isolated event instead of letting it become a foundational flaw of your entire being.
That's the cognitive piece, the reframing.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have to actively build new, durable behaviors and thought patterns through repetition, right? This is the active construction phase.
Absolutely. Repetition is just fundamental to building neurological durability. Think back to Hermann Ebbinghaus and his pioneering memory experiments in the late 19th century. He showed that the saving in relearning, the amount of effort saved when you relearn something you previously learned, was significant, even after time had passed.
Meaning practice actually leaves a physical trace.
Yes. It demonstrates that practice literally builds structure, physical structure, in the brain. It increases the efficiency of the neural pathways involved. Each repetition makes the pathway stronger, faster, more reliable.
So how do we best harness that effect when we're trying to build new positive habits or belief patterns?
Well, one really practical technique discussed in the sources is habit stacking. The idea here is to chain a new behavior you want to adopt onto an existing habit you already do automatically.
So you don't have to invent a whole new time slot or trigger for the new habit.
Exactly. You use the natural momentum of an established ritual. For example, a common one is, after I pour my morning cup of coffee, that's the old established habit, I will meditate for 60 seconds. That's the new habit. Or, after I take off my work shoes, old habit, I will immediately change to my workout clothes, new habit.
It's like building a small addition onto an existing solid foundation. You're leveraging the structure that's already there and strong.
Precisely. It's sometimes seen as a positive application of the Diderot effect, where getting one new thing makes you want other things that go with it. Here, one established action naturally pulls the next desired action along with it. And of course, reinforcement principles are key here too. Immediate rewards, even really small ones like mentally checking off the habit, increase the likelihood you'll stick with it. That repetition eventually leads to automaticity, where you don't even have to think about it anymore, and ultimately to mastery.
But the motivation behind it all matters hugely too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Our sources really highlight this difference between traditional motivation 2.0, the carrot and stick approach of rewards and punishment.
Right, extrinsic
Yeah,
motivators.
yeah. That works okay for simple routine tasks, but it can actually be detrimental, counterproductive for more complex, creative work. The kind of work often needed to really change deep beliefs.
This is where Daniel Pink's synthesis of decades of research on intrinsic motivation comes in. The finding is pretty clear. If a task is primarily algorithmic, meaning it's routine, you just follow a set of established steps, then extrinsic rewards like money or maybe threats of punishment can be effective in boosting performance, at least temporarily.
Okay, like working faster on an assembly line for a bonus.
Exactly. But for heuristic tasks, tasks that require complex problem solving, creativity, insight, finding novel solutions, those kinds of external rewards can actually trigger a stress response that narrows our cognitive focus.
Narrows our focus. How does that hurt creativity? Can you give an example?
Sure. Researchers have demonstrated this repeatedly with things like complex cognitive puzzles, like the famous candle problem. When participants are offered a significant cash reward for solving the puzzle quickly, especially one requiring an unconventional outside-the-box solution, they actually tend to perform worse and take longer than people offered no reward or only a small one.
That seems backward. Why?
The theory is the high stakes activate a mild stress response. That pressure makes the brain retreat to familiar, known solutions and strategies. It causes what psychologists call functional fixedness. You get stuck seeing objects or problems only in their most common, typical function. You fail to explore the novel, less obvious paths that are often required for creative breakthroughs or for finding new ways to think about old problems.
So for the kind of deep work needed to rebuild our internal architecture, we need something else.
Yes, we need environments and internal states driven by intrinsic motivation, the desire for mastery, getting better at something that matters, autonomy, having control over our work and approach, and purpose, connecting to something larger than ourselves. That's what fosters the flourishing self and allows us to build flexible, adaptive, and truly meaningful internal architecture. It draws on what Harlow called the third drive, beyond basic survival and external rewards.
What's fascinating, though, is that just changing our cognitive stories, our explanatory style, or even building new habits isn't always enough for the deepest kinds of healing, especially when we're dealing with past trauma. The restrictive architecture of belief often seems to be held not just in our thoughts, but in our bodies, too. It's somatic, physiological.
This is such a critical insight from fields like trauma therapy. Recovery often absolutely requires working through the physiological remnants of past beliefs and traumatic experiences, not just dredging up and analyzing the cognitive memory of what happened.
Because the trauma isn't just the story, it's the physical response.
Exactly. Trauma, in this view, needs to be defined primarily by its symptoms. The persistent hyperarousal, like being constantly jumpy or anxious, the defensive immobility or freeze response, that feeling of being stuck, which are housed deep within the nervous system in the body's memory.
So if you only try to fix the belief, that wasn't my fault, without addressing the body's ongoing fear response, like the racing heart or clenched jaw whenever something reminds you of it, you're what? Patching the roof, while the foundation is still shaking violently.
That's a perfect analogy. You're missing the deepest part of the structure. The work often requires gradually, carefully, and gently helping the body discharge that mobilized, stuck survival energy. Just focusing solely on detailed, explicit cognitive memories of the traumatic event can actually re-traumatize the person by overwhelming the nervous system and forcing it back into that trauma vortex.
Which is where that powerful analogy of Perseus and Medusa comes in, right?
Yes, it's used beautifully in some somatic healing modalities. Medusa represents the raw terror, the overwhelming core of the trauma.
And if you look directly at her,
You turn to stone. You become immobilized in fear, frozen in that trauma response, just like looking directly at the raw trauma can overwhelm you. So Perseus couldn't look directly. He had to use the reflection in his shield, the shield given by Athena representing wisdom and strategy.
so we work with the reflection.
We work with the reflection of the trauma as it manifests indirectly in our body sensations, our postures, our gut feelings, our instinctual responses. We use the shield of mindful self-awareness and compassionate attention to interact with these reflections, allowing the nervous system to gradually process the stored threat energy in manageable doses without being overwhelmed and re-traumatized.
And that indirect, embodied approach to healing the structure is what leads to transformation.
That's the idea. In the myth, from Medusa's severed neck sprung Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the warrior with the golden sword. Pegasus is often seen as symbolizing that transformation through embodiment, regaining fluidity, accessing instinctual grounding, finding a new freedom of movement and perspective.
And the golden sword.
That represents the clarity, the integration, the sense of resourcefulness and strength that emerges once the trauma energy is processed and integrated. You gain mastery over what previously controlled you.
And this path of embodied somatic healing can give us access to a state that's described in the internal family systems IFS model as self-energy. What is that, practically speaking? What does it feel like?
Self-energy, in IFS terms, is seen as the inherent core state of consciousness that we can access when we're not overwhelmed or blended with our protective or wounded parts, the parts carrying the fear, the anger, the shame from past experiences.
That's like the undamaged core.
Kind of. It's not just a list of positive adjectives. It's considered an active healing resource within us. It's characterized by qualities like calmness, curiosity, compassion, confidence, creativity, courage, connectedness, the C words. When we access this state, there's often a sense of clarity, an absence of racing thoughts, a feeling of spaciousness, and a connection to ourselves and others.
And this state helps the healing.
The model suggests that this self-energy is the resource that knows how to heal. It naturally blocks where energy isn't flowing well in our internal system, and it allows us to receive what the source material calls wise guidance from within. It's like the optimal state for architectural repair and renovation.
It sounds like a neurological architecture running cleanly, maybe for the first time, without being dragged down by all those defensive, protective parts that were built in response to past hurts.
That's a good way to think about it. It's like the engine running at its optimal design capacity, allowing the natural healing and integration process to occur.
Ultimately, the whole purpose of dismantling these old restrictive architectures and building new resilient ones, it seems like it's about orienting ourselves towards a life of meaning, right? That connects directly to Viktor Frankl's logotherapy.
Absolutely. Frankl, based on his experiences in the concentration camps and his clinical work, argued that much neurosis stems from what he called an existential vacuum, a fundamental lack of meaning in life. His whole therapeutic approach, logotherapy, centered on helping the patient find or rediscover meaning.
Because meaning itself is healing.
He believed it was essential for overcoming neurosis and finding the will to live, even in horrific circumstances, and he proposed that meaning could be found through three main avenues: through creating work or doing deeds, through experiencing something or encountering someone, like through love, or, crucially, through the attitude we choose to take toward unavoidable suffering.
That third way, finding meaning in our attitude towards suffering, that must offer profound hope, especially for someone who feels like a helpless victim of circumstance.
It provides immense solace and, importantly, agency. It suggests that even when external circumstances are terrible and unchangeable, we still retain the freedom to choose our inner response, our attitude, and find meaning in that stance itself. And when our new architecture, the one we build through recovery and growth, is aligned with that sense of meaning, with passion, with purpose, maybe with what feels like a true vocation, then the effort required for maintaining and growing that structure changes completely.
It stops feeling like relentless, hard work.
It often ceases to feel oppressive. The sources share that anecdote about a father watching his kids who had left traditional schooling to passionately pursue acting and painting. He observed that they became incredibly relentless, persistent workers, putting in huge hours.
But it didn't feel like a burden to them.
No, because, as he put it, to them it's not at all oppressive. When the architecture of yourself, your daily actions, your core beliefs, are aligned with intrinsic purpose and meaning, the motivation becomes largely self-sustaining. The hard work involved in growth and maintenance starts to feel like necessary fuel, like something that energizes you, rather than like pushing against constant resistance.
Okay, so pulling this all together, this deep dive really shows us, pretty conclusively I think, that the stories we tell ourselves aren't just fleeting thoughts. They are, quite literally, the brain's durable operating system.
The software, and maybe even influencing the hardware over time.
Yeah, and that system gets built, starting from our earliest experiences, our conditioning like Pavlov showed, filtered through innate structures like Jung's archetypes. And then once built, is rigorously maintained by these powerful psychological defenses, cognitive dissonance, selection bias, that actively fight against any information that might require updating the architecture.
Which means that true flourishing change isn't usually easy or accidental. It's a highly disciplined process. It requires that active deconstruction of the limiting beliefs, like the ones telling you it's personal, permanent, pervasive, through conscious cognitive reframing.
Yeah.
And crucially, the intentional daily construction of new resilient behavioral patterns, grounded not just in rethinking things, but often in embodied somatic healing, and ideally aligned with a deeper sense of purpose or meaning.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, maybe looping back to those deep archetypal structures. Jung talked about the archetype of the wise old man or wise old woman. This figure tends to appear in dreams or maybe insights precisely when deep understanding or new perspective is desperately needed, but we can't seem to muster it from our own conscious resources alone.
It's like an internal resource that compensates for a spiritual or psychological deficiency, offering guidance when the current architecture is stuck.
And sometimes, the shift in consciousness, the thing that shatters the old, rigid architecture, it isn't gradual. It's described in some sources almost like a sudden, unexpected, overpowering, liberating flash of lightning.
Yeah, that flash that suddenly illuminates everything differently, maybe shattering the sharpness of the bitter sting of nature, as one text put it, allowing the sense of liberty or freedom to shine forth. It's that ultimate moment of architectural breakthrough, of paradigm shift.
But we probably can't just sit around waiting for lightning bolts, right? We have to start the work of rebuilding, maybe more deliberately, brick by brick. So if your old architecture feels rigid, resistant, stuck, what small intentional flash, what tiny crack in the old wall can you introduce today to begin that disciplined process of deconstruction and rebuilding?
And that leads to the final, really provocative thought here, connecting back to the necessity of practice, discipline, maybe even sacrifice for long-term change. If you assume, just for a moment, that your current struggle, that frustrating pattern, that defensive reaction you keep having, if you assume that's actually the necessary foundation for an eventual, profound healing, the grit needed to build something stronger.
Like the pressure needed to form a diamond.
Kind of. If that struggle could eventually lead to mastery and wisdom, then what temporary sacrifice, what small bit of discomfort, maybe sitting with an unpleasant feeling instead of reacting, maybe doing that difficult practice, maybe challenging that comfortable old belief about what are you avoiding right now? What small, difficult act are you putting off that could lead to the immediate reinforcement of a new, slightly better story about yourself and your capabilities?
Because that small, difficult act might be the very thing that accesses that self-energy, that inner resource waiting to guide the rebuild.
That could be the starting point, that initial uncomfortable step.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We hope you use this architecture review wisely.